This lecture video is on the Age of Jackson, 1828 to 1848. The era of good feelings did not last beyond James Monroe's term. Americans believed that they had entered a post-partisan era in politics. The factionalism never disappeared, though. While the Federalist Party could not mount a serious challenge in national politics, its members never went away, nor did its ideology. There was still a belief in using the federal government to support industry and internal improvements. It was termed nationalism and embraced by many Democratic Republicans. More still, the question of slavery continued to cause fractures in the American body politic as well as society. The controversial presidency of Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, brought all of these tensions into society out in the open, resulting in the resurgence of two-party politics. This video will identify key people and events in the events of the Jacksonian era. It will examine the political policies of Andrew Jackson and understand the changes in political ideology and alignment in this period. We have to start by looking at the end of the era of good feelings. Remember that the era of good feelings existed under President James Monroe, who was in office from 1817 to 1825. He was the last of the Revolutionary generation, and he came into power after the conclusion of the War of 1812, a war in which the only major opposition to the Democratic Republicans, the Federalist Party, had followed some disastrous policies and declined in national support. During the era of good feelings, the United States of America witnessed great expansion in transportation and industry and Western migration. The western section of the country felt a need for federal aid in building internal improvements to get crops to markets. National industrialists wanted protection of their goods. They wanted to secure trade treaties and federal support of internal improvements. But keep in mind that at this time, the southern states only really had a growing interest in cotton production. While they still produced other agricultural products such as tobacco and indigo, rice, cotton had by the mid 1820s become what they called king throughout the South. And one thing about cotton was that it did not need internal improvements to get to market. One of the most cost-effective ways that large plantation owners used in order to get their cotton bales to market was to simply transport them to the nearest river and then float them down to port cities such as New Orleans, from whence they would get a ride. They would get transported on board usually northern ships, either to New England or to England itself. So basically, the southern societies had become reliant on one crop for the great amounts of wealth that they were producing. Keep in mind, during this period, large plantation owners were the equivalents today of our Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates in terms of sheer wealth. The wealth that they produced was unparalleled throughout much of the United States of America. And all of this wealth depended on slavery. The southern states had essentially become a slave society in which slavery touched on everything from social interactions to the economy. During the President Monroe's administration, slavery came to a head in an argument over admitting Missouri into the United States of America. For a while, people feared that this would lead to civil war. Thomas Jefferson himself even likened it to a fire bell that sounded in the night, awakening the nation to the danger that this division presented. And for many Americans, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had put the issue to bed by drawing a line along what is called now the Mason-Dixon line, where south of that line, slavery would no longer would be allowed. South of that line, where slavery would be allowed into the United States, and north of that line, it would not. In addition to that, the Missouri Compromise basically enshrined in antebellum politics a formula to maintain balance between the slave and the free states. The idea was that for every new free state admitted, a slave state would be admitted, and this would maintain balance in the Senate. Moreover, Southerners would be further placated because of the Three-Fifths Compromise. Keep in mind that counting 3/5 of the slave population gave the southern states a great boost in the House of Representatives. Between the balance in the Senate, their inflated representation in the House of Representatives, as well as the fact that they were the ones sending more presidents to the White House and Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court, it basically meant that the slave states could exist within the Union without fear that the northern states would interfere with this institution. Today we recognize that the era of good feelings was not a post-partisan era. In fact, what had basically happened was that factionalism went from a two-party form to a series of struggles within one party. The Democratic Republicans were not really a united party. You had groups of individuals that dubbed themselves the Old Republicans that followed true to Thomas Jefferson's views of limited government spending, a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, as well as limited federal involvement in the economy. On the other hand was a growing group of Republicans represented on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line that dubbed themselves nationalist Republicans. Now, by nationalist, they did not refer to the common usage of nationalism embraced by geographers and historians and political scientists. In academic jargon, nationalism refers to one people with a common language, common history, common territory, usually a common ethnic background, common religion. By nationalist, what they meant was the use of the federal government to link the different markets and section of the nation together. The biggest proponent of the National Republican beliefs was Henry Clay, the senator from Kentucky who had fashioned the Missouri Compromise. Clay's American system called for a protective tariff for industries, markets to be opened up within the nation for agriculture as well as abroad. They supported the National Bank of the United States of America as a way of extending credit to industry and farmers, as well as to regulate currency. And they wholeheartedly supported using federal funds for internal improvements. In order to overcome the obstacles that distance and geography played within the United States of America, nationalist Republicans believed that the federal government had to be involved in creating canals and public roads to connect the eastern seaboard of the United States of America with the Trans-Appalachian regions. In order to construct these projects, however, it took quite a bit of money. Now, it is true that the Erie Canal was constructed within New York through private and public expenditures, but it took 8 years. And one of the things about the Erie Canal is that it was really kind of limited in terms of the geography that it crossed. When we take into account trying to connect Eastern Virginia with Western Virginia, or connecting the Carolinas over to what was then considered the hinterland of Alabama or Mississippi, suddenly geography becomes much more imposing as you have to breach through the Appalachian Mountains, as you no longer have those closely connected river systems and Great Lakes and large rivers that many of the northern states benefited from. But the National Republicans, keep in mind, faced a lot of opposition from old Republicans as well as from states' rights advocates throughout the American South. Now, in 1824, there was another election held, and like the election that sent John James Monroe back to the White House, it was held largely with with candidates from one party. Now, the way that politics worked in the 1800s is that individuals within the administration were viewed as being set up depending on their cabinet position to succeed as president. So there were quite a few individuals of great skill, great reputation, and key positions within government that viewed that it was their time to take over the mantle of leadership of the executive branch. Now, for most politicians of the time, none other than William Crawford, Secretary of the Treasury, stood poised to succeed James Monroe as President of the United States of America. William Crawford did have support throughout the South, and he was close to the former president. However, before the election of 1824, William Crawford fell ill, possibly from a stroke, basically preventing him from seriously running for the office. Other major contenders were Henry Clay, Speaker of the House of Representatives, the individual that helped lead the Missouri Compromise through the House and the Senate. There was John Quincy Adams. He had been Secretary of State under James Monroe. He was the author behind the Monroe Doctrine and had been instrumental in getting Florida connected to the United States of America, as well as being the son of one of the famed framers of or leaders of the American Revolution, John Adams. There was also John C. Calhoun, who was Secretary of War. He himself also commanded a large following within the southern states. And then there was the newcomer, Andrew Jackson, senator from Tennessee. Now, during the election of 1824, most people viewed Andrew Jackson as an outlier and a radical. Most politicians within the Democratic Republican Party really didn't like the prospect of a Jacksonian presidency. But one thing about Andrew Jackson was that he was very much a populist president. He himself started from very humble roots, was self-educated, and made a fortune for himself, later becoming a major plantation owner. During the War of 1812, he had led militia units against the Creek Nation, the Baton Rouge, in Georgia, in Alabama, and then later turned his militia to the defense of New Orleans against General Pakenham's British soldiers. Andrew Jackson was also a very strict Jeffersonian in ideology. He was very suspicious of national banks. He did not like the idea of internal improvements. In fact, Andrew Jackson, like much of the other nations, suffered heavily during the Panic of 1819. Europe, coming out of the Napoleonic Wars, was readjusting economically, and ripples within their economy spread across the Atlantic Ocean, affecting the United States of America. To make matters worse, the American banking system really was in a very precarious position, and there had been much speculation on Western lands. So to help shore up the American economy through monetary policy, the Bank of the United States of America had basically started calling in loans and demanding that state banks start using more sound currency policies. While it was an intelligent move in terms of saving the Bank of the United States, it did add to a contraction and a limit in the amount of specie that was being circulated at the time. And so historians generally recognize that, yes, the Bank of America, the Bank of the United States, did add to the Panic of 1819. But for Andrew Jackson, the Bank of the United States of America was the main cause, the main culprit of moneyed elites in the eastern states and especially the Northeast, working against the agrarian interests as well as the small farmer. But again, his ideology was really out of line with most of the leaders within the Senate and the House of Representatives. In fact, if you take a look at the major contenders for the presidency, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and at this time, John C. Calhoun, all supported nationalist policies. What ended up happening was that in the popular vote, Andrew Jackson won. But at this time, it was not necessarily the popular vote that determined who was going to be the next president. Instead, American politics still relied on the caucus system. In the caucus system, it was basically politicians and usually delegates within the House of Representatives and state legislatures that even determined who was actually going to run for president. So there was much more distance then than today between the electorate and the actual voting for the president of the United States. Now, in addition to that, the electoral vote did not produce a clear winner. Instead, it left two leading contenders, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. So without a majority necessary to send one of these individuals to the White House, the job fell to the House of Representatives. And there, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, wielded a great amount of power. Now, again, Henry Clay was already of the same ideology as John Quincy Adams, and so it was natural that Henry Clay, with his American system, would support Adams's bid for the presidency. But what happened in the waning days of the voting between the House representatives was that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay ended up having a private 3-hour meeting that today we still don't know, what was said. And after the meeting, shortly after the meeting, Henry Clay goes into Congress, basically throws his full force behind the candidacy of John Quincy Adams. And the end result was that John Quincy Adams ended up winning the presidency without winning the popular vote, and still trailing Jackson in the electoral votes from the general election. Now, what made matters worse is that after the election, John Quincy Adams turned to Henry Clay and offered him the cabinet position of Secretary of State. And at this time, usually it was the Secretary of State that was viewed as the natural successor to the President of the United States of America. So Andrew Jackson, after he got wind of all that had happened, cried that this was a corrupt bargain, and he used this again and again in his letters. And Andrew Jackson, even right after the election of 1824, he wasn't looking for years from then to start his election campaign. Instead, he started it immediately. And to help him with his election campaign, he turned to an individual that had been well schooled in the politics, the rough and tumble politics of New York State, Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren began the process of creating the first real party machinery within the United States of America that connected local organizations of Jacksonian supporters to newspaper editors that had a large following, crafting imagery, propaganda, all sorts of things that, associated people's support with Andrew Jackson. So, for example, one of the things that became famous under Martin Van Buren's efforts were things like hickory canes, because Andrew Jackson, from his strict disciplinarianism as the leader of the militia that fought the Creeks and the British, had become known as Old Hickory. So what essentially is happening in 1824 is it's the early stages of a crack within the Democratic Republicans and the formation really of two different parties, that of the Jacksonian Democrats and the National Republicans. Now, when all was said and done, President John Quincy Adams entered the White House. And John Quincy Adams was a very gifted individual. You know, he had been ambassador, secretary of state, been with his father during the Revolution. As a young man, you know, he had actually worked as a secretary for American ambassadors. I mean, very intelligent, law degree. I mean, just this was an individual whose whole life was tailored towards politics. When he came into the office, his intention was to extend the era of good feelings. And to that end, he basically kept James Monroe's cabinet. You know, he promised that, you know, he wasn't really going to interfere in, you know, slavery where it existed. You know, didn't want to rankle the Southerners. Promised a nationalist policy towards creating internal improvements and fostering trade. And then he even went further. You know, he tried to foster mutual pan-American relations with the new republics of Central and South America. He called for the creation of a national observatory, a national university, a naval academy, all of these things that he believed would transform the United States, not only in terms of material needs, but also intellectual needs as well. Problem is that John Quincy Adams was too much of an idealist, and too little of a politician. Like his father before him, he was not necessarily gifted with great charisma. And so what happened is early in the Adams administration, supporters of Andrew Jackson, or people that, like John C. Calhoun, that believed that John Quincy Adams had usurped the presidency, you know, because John C. Calhoun believed that it had become his time, you know, to become president. They began to work against him. And so this happened within Congress, where old Republicans and friends of Andrew Jackson worked to basically limit and undermine any of Adams's policies. It worked within his own cabinet, where John C. Calhoun himself worked with Jacksonians and other people to basically undercut all of Adams's efforts. So in the long run, John Quincy Adams's presidency really did not achieve all the things that it hoped for. So going into the election of 1828, Jackson, who had been spending 4 years to prepare, was in a good position, and John Quincy Adams, who had been hamstrung by all these different factions, was facing an uphill battle. And the election of 1828 turned out to be a very nasty election. Not only was it the first election where party machinery came out full force to rally the masses through propaganda, but a lot of this propaganda was what we would call today mudslinging. So the coffin handbill, for example, was something that supporters of Adams used, you know, National Republicans used, where they would print off these handbills with these coffins of American soldiers that Jackson had executed for failing to follow orders. There were handbills about Jackson's invasion into Florida and his hanging of 2 British citizens after a very dubious court-martial. Even Jackson's wife was brought into the fray. Rachel Jackson had actually been married prior to their engagement and wedding ceremony. And at this time, keep in mind that communication was very slow, and there was all sorts of different problems with, you know, how one state dealt with marriage from another. And so when they married, there was a question as to whether or not it was actually a bigamous relation on the part of Rachel Jackson, about whether or not she had actually gotten a divorce to begin with. And of course, keep in mind that during this time period, it was still very much frowned upon for women to get divorces. And then to make matters worse, Rachel Jackson died suddenly prior to the Jackson winning the election. And so when he went into the office, he blamed National Republicans for her death, and he held a grudge and acted on that grudge throughout his administration. Now, keep in mind, Quincy Adams wasn't left alone either. There were these scandalous accusations that during his time as ambassador to Russia, that he had, for example, procured American women to act as prostitutes for Russian nobles. And then, of course, there was the corrupt bargain issue. So very nasty conflict, but this time around, Jackson came out clearly the winner. His party machine truly is what made a difference, as well as his popular appeal. So when President Andrew Jackson came into office, he came in with this feeling that he had a mandate from the people. Moreover, he would end up transforming the presidency because he believed that he was the voice of the people. And so, whereas former presidents rarely used the veto, and usually only in very rare circumstances, Andrew Jackson would end up using the veto, especially during the bank war. And he would not only do it for constitutional issues, but he would even say, it's the will of the people that I do this. So even a new use of the veto. So Andrew Jackson, when he came into office, one of the things that he did is he laid the foundation for what becomes known as the spoils system. So basically, throughout from this point on, the 1900s, what would usually happen is when a new administration came into power, they would repay their supporters and their friends by giving them choice positions. So postmasters, for example, these during this time period were great positions because it brought in money and it brought in, a position of privilege to the office holder. Now, there is one thing about Andrew Jackson is that if you actually take a look at the statistics, he only replaced about 9% of the total federal agents within the government. So that's bringing them in and firing them. But one thing that Andrew Jackson was not afraid to do was basically to put his weight against somebody that was sitting in office that he didn't think needed to be there until finally they relented and resigned from the position. So while he did not use it as unscrupulously as people would in the later 1800s, we do see the beginning of this spoils system, and throughout the 19th century until the 1870s and 80s, a reform of the civil service to prevent these kinds of actions would end up becoming a recurring motif within American politics. Now, another thing about Andrew Jackson is that he actually relied more on a group of informal advisors that have been dubbed the kitchen cabinet. So he did appoint some of his supporters, like John C. Calhoun, to chief choice positions within the government. So John C. Calhoun, for example, had supported him, and so when Jackson went into office, he brought John C. Calhoun with him. But he didn't always really hold the opinion of his cabinet in the highest of regards, and so it was his kitchen cabinet, his friends, that he would oftentimes, formulate policy with. And the Jackson administration from the beginning was viewed as something of a chaotic situation. So in his inauguration, for example, he opened up the White House to the masses. And you had this mob of people that basically forced their way into the White House, and they started, through the amount of people in there and all of the commotion, breaking things and overturning tables. And the only way to get them out of the White House was to basically take all this liquor out on the front lawn and just, entice them out there with booze. And it didn't even stop with his inauguration. There was an incident known as the Eaton Affair. When he came into office, he had individuals that critics believed were not fit to hold the office in positions of power. So his Secretary of War was an individual named John Eaton, and Eaton had some scandals within his personal life that made his qualifications even seem, worse than what they were. So within his personal life, for example, was his marriage. In 1829, he had married a woman by the name of Margaret Peggy O'Neill Timberlake, who was the daughter of a Washington tavern owner and the wife of a Navy purser. And her husband had the individual by the last name of Timberlake had actually ended up committing suicide. But before he committed suicide, Eaton had actually started staying in the tavern, and it was shortly after his suicide that Peggy O'Neill Timberlake ended up marrying John Eaton. And so there was a lot of rumors about whether or not they had had an affair and whether or not this affair had led to the suicide. Now, there was no problem, at this time with Washington starting and, keeping alive rumors, just as, it's same thing as we have today in the United States. Scandalous stories make headlines. But it was made even worse by John C. Calhoun's wife, Fluoride. Fluoride basically led the other wives of the cabinet not to have anything to do with Peggy Eaton. She basically became persona non grata at social functions. And so this acrimony between cabinet spouses ended up going upwards to the cabinet level. And eventually it forced Jackson to address the issue. Of course, Jackson, having lost his wife Rachel to similar scandalous accusations, really kind of zeroed in on John C. Calhoun because of the role that Fluoride had played in this whole issue. And so what basically ended up happening is he had a shuffling within his cabinet, and then he, on top of that, refused to even meet with some of his cabinet members, which further distanced them and ended up turning them into opponents. And so there was this whole Eaton affair, this dispute between cabinet member spouses over an alleged but never even substantiated affair that almost brought his administration to crisis. Now, there were some other issues within Jackson's presidency as well that were monumental, one of which was the nullification crisis. Keep in mind, Jackson was an individual that advocated for more rights for average people and strict construction of the Constitution. Like Jefferson, he believed there was a need for manufacturers, but he did not want to really use the federal government to support them or internal improvements. He believed in states' rights and strict constructionism. He hated the Second Bank of the United States. And, he was suspicious over tariffs, but he did recognize that Congress had the right to pass them. So the nullification crisis all started over a tariff. So basically what the United States Congress had done, and this started in the War of 1812, was to use protective tariffs as a way of waging economic warfare on Britain and France for seizing their vessels by placing incredibly high taxes on imported goods from those countries. But following the War of 1812, it also became a very standard way of funding internal improvements as well as protecting nascent American industries. Now, in 1824, the tariff of 1824 increased some of their tariffs, and in support for the tariff had actually begun to wane, largely because of the Panic of 1819. They were losing support for tariffs both by northern states, some Westerners, but especially Southerners. So in 1828, when a new tariff was passed, uh, Southerners labeled it the Tariff of Abominations, and they viewed it as very sectionalist. Uh, there was no question that it was used to generate votes for the Democratic, or for elements within the Jacksonian Democratic Party. It was being used to lure more Western votes for the protection of certain products, as well as those industries in the Northwest and the Northeast. But throughout the southern states, they believed that trading off a tariff for these votes was not in their best interest. In fact, it was threatening their their general welfare. Now, South Carolina ended up taking the lead in denouncing the tariff, and they turned to their leading statesman, John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, by 1828, had turned away from his nationalist policies and embraced a very strict construction of the Constitution. In fact, as part of his kind of rehabilitation of his public image and his ideology, he had written what was known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And he went through and he argued that tariffs were constitutionally designed to raise revenue but not promote or protect one industry over another. And he relied on earlier writings that he had published, in which he basically claimed that the biggest threat to American democracy was a reliance on the numerical majority. Uh, Basically, he viewed Southern rights to hold slaves as under attack, and since that was under attack, so was their whole way of life. And so he advocated some changes to American politics. He believed, first of all, that legislation should rely not on the number of votes in Congress, but by what he dubbed a concurrent majority, so that each section of the country would have to vote, and it would be a majority of sectional votes that would determine law. So instead of voting per representative and senator, for example, the South would have a vote, the North would have a vote, the West would have a vote. He even suggested the potential for electing multiple presidents. And he really kind of went out there on this one. But one of the things that he grabbed hold of and really developed was Jefferson and Madison's ideas of state nullification of unwanted federal laws that they had presented with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And so he basically made the argument that the states were the entities that drafted and ratified the Constitution, that it was therefore a pact between the states and not between the people and the federal government, which is not accurate when one reads the history and the text of the U.S. Constitution. And since he believed, or according to his argument, since it was a pact between the states and the government, the states had the right to veto unconstitutional legislation. So this is what would happen in 1832. You already had one tariff, the Tariff of Abominations, that was hated. And then you had this uprising over it. So in 1832, 4 years later, John Quincy Adams, who was now in the House of Representatives, tried to find a way to reconcile both sides. And so they passed the tariff of 1832 that actually lowered tariffs to placate the South, but the South said they were going to have none of it, or at least South Carolina did. So on November 19th, 1832, 162 South Carolinian statesmen met at Columbia, South Carolina, and there they passed the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring the Tariff of 1832 null and void as of February 1st, 1833. But to make sure that they were not seen as declaring independence and seceding, they stated in no uncertain terms that it was nullified only within South Carolina, and they encouraged other states to follow suit. Now, Jackson, even though he did believe in states' rights, he was very much against the mere notion of secession. So, what he did is in his State of the Union address, he urged the passage of a new tariff to substantially reduce taxes, import taxes. And he also stated in no unclear terms that South Carolina's actions were treasonous. And he then had Congress used his influence to have Congress pass two pieces of legislation. The first was the Compromise Tariff of 1833 that offered a swift series of reductions until 1842 of the tariff. But they also passed the Force Bill, which was called the Bloody Bill in South Carolina. And Jackson signed both of them on March 2nd, 1833. And what the Force Bill basically told South Carolina was either you're going to accept the laws that Congress passes, or Jackson himself would lead an army down to South Carolina and force it down their throats. So South Carolina, facing the prospect of an invading army led by Jackson himself and also having this compromise tariff, they backed down and they withdrew the ordinance of nullification. One thing that they didn't do, though, they did not renounce the theory of nullification. So right after they withdrew the ordinance nullification, they turned right around and passed another ordinance nullifying the Force Bill, which was already null and void because they had agreed to follow the law. I mean, the Force Bill's whole purpose was to force South Carolina to accept the tariff. So they basically nullified a nullified law. Regardless, it leaves a legacy. So from the nullification crisis onwards, what Americans saw was anytime there was law passed that Southerners thought in any way, shape, or form threatened their economy or the institution of slavery, they would always lean back on this idea of secession. And sometimes they would extend muted or veiled threats of secession, other times outright threats. And people that, in the 1850s that really took to this as a tactic and a way of life became known as fire eaters because they were always screaming secession. Now, the final major issue of the Jacksonian presidency was the Bank War. And the Bank War was a series of conflicts between Andrew Jackson and really the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle. It resulted in the collapse of the bank. So right after Jackson came into office, the president of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, saw the writing on the wall. He realized that Jackson was going to threaten the bank. And Biddle realized that he needed to secure its extension, the extension of the charter that Congress issued it in 1816, because he didn't want to leave it up to chance should Jackson, try to move against it. And on top of that, the second bus, as it's often referred to, Second Bank of the United States. And, really, it was a very good institution. It did have the power to limit speculation and currency manipulation and unsound monetary policies and wildcat banking practices. The problem is that some of its leadership, its early leadership, wasn't fit for the position. So William Jones, the very first president, his policies were so bad that it fed speculation and unsound currency policies amongst state banks. And it was Langdon Cheves who basically had to fix what Jones did. But the problem is that Cheves's policies ended up, feeding into the developing panic of 1819. And then there was Nicholas Biddle, who was brilliant and really kind of made the bank work and function the way it was supposed to work. But he was considered elitist by people like Jackson. And on top of that, the bank, and the way that it was structured, didn't, it was still a private bank chartered by the United States that, housed treasury currency. The fact that there wasn't really much government oversight really rankled people like Andrew Jackson. So what Nicholas Biddle tried to do is he tried to sneak it in under the radar. So even though it wasn't up, its charter wasn't up for renewal until about 1832. I'm sorry, up 1836. Right at the end of the Jacksonian second term, he decides, while Jackson was focusing on Indian removal and the Eaton affair, what he would try to do is he would try to sneak it in early. And the problem is that it didn't work. Jackson sees the move right away, and he ended up vetoing the legislation. And when he vetoed it, this is one of his uses, his novel uses of the veto power of the president. So some of his logic is just really incredibly poor in this. One of the first things he says is that he was vetoing it because it was unconstitutional. Congress didn't have the explicitly stated right to charter a bank. Of course, this completely ignores McCulloch versus Maryland, and Jackson, being trained in law, should have known this. And he also says that in addition to that, it was foreigners and wealthy people that owned and benefited from the bank. Well, yes, you could buy stocks in the bank, but it didn't necessarily mean they outright owned it. The United States of America still had, some control over it through its charter. And it wasn't just the investors that benefited from it. Everybody benefited from it because of sound monetary policy. And then finally, what he does is he just simply says it's a social philosophy and he's supported by the people. The people want this. I represent the people, so I'm vetoing it. So he vetoes this, and then afterwards, starting in 1833, this is when, that's phase one. This is, Biddle, 1829, tries to sneak this in. 1832, all comes up, and Jackson vetoes it. And after that, what Jackson starts doing is he just starts undercutting it. So the second phase, 1833 to 34, what he does is he just simply turns to the Secretary of the Treasury, a guy by the name of Roger B. Taney, an individual who will later become a Supreme Court justice and become infamous for his Dred Scott decision. Orders Secretary of Treasury Roger B. Taney to just basically start depositing money in state banks. And here we see the spoils system really at work, the patronage system, as it would be called, because the state banks that they were directed to were Jacksonian institutions only. So they were called his quote-unquote pet banks. And these banks, now that the Bank of the United States was being undercut, they really had no oversight on their actions, and they would start feeding into land speculation, issuing currency that they had no specie to back up if it was turned in and redeemed, which is what made banknotes have any value to begin with. And they basically start this this cycle that will lead in 5 years to an even worse panic than 1819, the Panic of 1837. So this is phase two, just strangling the bank. And then finally what happens is 1834, 1836, what we consider the third phase, this is when they succeeded in destroying it. It goes under, its charter expires, and it's no more. But then you have phase four, and this is the post-second bus economy, which basically is a depression. All these wildcat banks, all this uncounted currency that's out there, just brings the whole thing crashing down. So under Jackson, these two new presidential parties emerged, and they emerged with a vengeance. And while the National Republicans wouldn't survive the Jacksonian period, a new, more powerful party would. So after Jackson left, his successor was Martin Van Buren, the guy nicknamed the Little Magician for his ability to lead elections and party machines. And as a successor to Jackson, Martin Van Buren led what was now known as the Jacksonian Democrats. And Martin Van Buren basically just continued Jackson's policies. including what was known as the Specie Circular passed under Jackson that basically demanded that state banks or the federal government only accept hard currency for everything from taxes to land sales. Basically, it was this hard currency policy. Problem is, the United States of America, since the colonial era, always had a shortage of specie, as it was called, or hard currency. So this ends up leading to a severe contraction with the U.S. economy, a currency shortage, especially along the East Coast where industrialists and merchants really needed it. And it just spirals out of control when all of these little pet banks, state banks, start collapsing one after another. When people start demanding, that they be able to redeem these banknotes. And of course, the state banks didn't have the gold and the silver in their vaults to pay it. And so all of this ends up bringing Martin Van Buren's presidency down. In fact, a new party forms from the ashes of the panic and just the division that Jackson created. And this is known as the Whig Party. And the Whig Party was basically formed by, a solid core of national Republicans that were joined by people that actually had beliefs similar to Jackson's, but just literally hated the guy, as well as small farmers, shopkeepers, merchants, industrialists, this whole group. And the Whig Party, like the Jacksonian Democrats, they would have a support base. The Whig was in the north, the Democrats were in the south, but like the Democrats also, the Whig Party did have supporters in other sections of the country as well. But after this, what really becomes the forefront of American politics would become slavery and national expansion. All these other issues would be there, but, really starting under William Henry Harrison and continuing, his very, very, very brief presidency, and, really John Tyler's presidency, continuing under Polk, was first the annexation of Texas, and then after that, the Mexican-American War, the annexation of all the land they got from it, as well as the Oregon Country situation where, Britain and the United States was still jointly occupying this. All of these became major issues, and slavery became wrapped up in it as new territory opened up for settlement. The question became, would this be slave or would it be free? So following the election of 1840, there was no longer any question of returning to the era of good feelings. Democrats and Whigs continued to clash over internal improvements, strict constructionism versus loose constructionism, and other traditional concerns. However, the annexation of Texas that was accomplished under John Tyler foreshadowed a new major concern in American politics, which was Western expansion and extension of slavery. The age of Jackson is dated from 1828 to 1848, and with good reason. As the 1840s came to a close, the United States had finally realized an age-old dream of expanding its borders from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And they had even laid the foundation for acquiring Hawaii through the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions sending missionaries to the island. Yet the success came with a cost to the country by further dividing it over the issue of slavery and marching it towards civil war.